Why isn't Donald Trump coming tomorrow? Because he has a 4-year-old mentality, and he's having a tantrum. He's having a tantrum. What is the tantrum? That the rest of the world says, we don't want a king. As President Lula said, we don't need an emperor. He would come here as just one of 20 leaders, or 21. He doesn't want that. He's having a tantrum. So this rebalancing is happening. He's having a particular tantrum, by the way, because the United States is in a deeply neurotic funk.
Furious world leaders at the G20 in South Africa made a powerful statement against the United States boycott of the G20, which is being held in South Africa. The Trump regime is boycotting the G20 in South Africa because Donald Trump has fabricated that there is a white genocide taking place in South Africa. So he says the United States is out, to which the world leaders in the G20, or should I call it the G19, they're like, great. We don't want you here. When you're here, we have to deal with your drama, your baby behavior, and all of the baggage that comes with you. And you're like an asset for Putin. Why the hell would we want you here? So the G19, no longer the G20, they did something unprecedented. So they gave their united declaration of the G20, or now the G19, immediately, right when the conference starts. They did it. Now that never happens. What they normally do is you wait until the end of the conference, and then there's a lot of negotiation going back and forth about what the declaration is, the joint statement coming out of the G20 would be. Not this time. So Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, he, on behalf of the united G19 minus the United States, says, here are our values. Multilateralism can and does deliver. And Donald Trump's whole position is being anti-multilateralism. Trump's whole thing is go it alone. So the G20, now the G19, immediately said, we stand together, we support each other, we support multilateralism.
I think in the end, but it's a close call, but I think in the end, the world trading system will go forward without the United States, basically. That the end of all of this is U.S. isolation, with the rest of the world basically continuing along, even the formal rules of the World Trade Organization. Trump has something quite different in mind, which is that the U.S. remains at the center of the power and the center of the system, and even that, and they've been quite explicit about this, that other countries will fall into line with the United States against China. So not merely fall into line with the U.S., but will actually join the trade war against China. No doubt that is a major goal in Washington right now, at least of some of this administration and much of the political scene. There's an overwhelming anti-China vision in Washington, and the idea that other countries will join against China is their hope. The reason I think it's not likely is that if you take a hard look at what real economic power the United States still maintains, it's nowhere close to what Trump believes. Trump's idea is that the U.S. market is so central to every economy that basically the leverage that the United States gets over the threat of cutting other countries out of the U.S. is enough to get them to do America's foreign policy bidding. That may have been true 25 years ago. I think it's an anachronistic view today. And the reason is simply the numbers. The U.S. imports are just not big enough for most countries to say that they're going to uh, shift their whole foreign policy and economic orientation because of a U.S. threat.
Hello, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel and I hope you're doing great from wherever you're watching this video from today. Welcome once again for a good video. Now, I'd say that for many years, many of us grow up believing that the United States of America was like the center of the world, the gravity, the dreamland, the global leader, and even the unquestioned police of the world. But recently, the G20 Summit took place in South Africa, and the United States of America, under, of course, Donald Trump, was a no-show. It simply did not show up. No president, no top officials, nothing. And but guess what? The world moved on without them, and this is conspicuous because these are not the kinds of summits we have grown up seeing the United States of America not being part of. Leaders met, of course, and decisions were made, and global alliances, of course, continued shifting, proving something that maybe the West and, of course, America, and maybe even the entire world has not imagined just yet properly, that the world does not stop when America steps back or lags behind, because this is lagging behind, and we're going to prove it in a minute. So many Americans and other people across the world, even top American scholars, are calling this one out. One of them is Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who openly questioned Trump's absence and America's growing insecurity in a world where other powers, especially China, are rising, without firing a single shot, without being so dramatic. And but before we really unpack this, the whole of what really transpired and what it really means for Africa, especially for China and the fading American empire, I want us to listen to what Professor Jeffrey Sachs had to say in this particular summit, and we'll be back with a good analysis. So see you on the other side.
Why isn't Donald Trump coming tomorrow? Because he has a 4-year-old mentality, and he's having a he's having a tantrum. He's having a tantrum. What is the tantrum? That the rest of the world says, we don't want a king. As President Lula said, we don't need an emperor. He would come here as just one of 20 leaders, or 21. He doesn't want that. He's having a tantrum. So this rebalancing is happening. He's having a particular tantrum, by the way, because the United States is in a deeply neurotic funk. You know what the cause of that neurosis is? China. A wonderful, brilliant civilization, 4,000 years old plus. It's been a unified state with brilliant statecraft for more than 2,000 years. Unlike Europe, in which every country of Europe fought every other country of Europe every year for 1,000 years. Most of the time, China was peaceful, united. It fragmented temporarily at some points, but it was mainly a unified country that actually, strangely enough, didn't beat up its neighbors also. So China, for 1,000 years, never attacked Japan, for example. Can you imagine? Britain couldn't keep its hands off any place for more than a year or two at a time. It had to go beat up somebody. And the United States doesn't even take a year off. I don't know the truth yet. It could be an accident, but I don't think so. Today, a major refinery in Venezuela suddenly exploded. That seems a lot like the CIA to me. I don't guarantee it. We don't have any more news. But last week, President Trump said he had assigned the CIA to operations inside Venezuela, and a week later, suddenly the biggest refinery blows up. So the United States can hardly go a week at a time without trying to kill somebody. But China actually goes centuries without attacking its neighbors. So China went for 1,000 years without once invading Japan, a near neighbor, even though China was much more powerful. Incidentally, from 2 times there was an attempt to invade Japan from the Chinese mainland, but that was when China had been conquered by the Mongols. So 800 years ago, roughly, they tried twice. The Mongols tried to invade Japan, and they were defeated both times. But the Chinese never tried. The Japanese actually, sadly, invaded China many times, but never the other way around. And the Chinese never invaded Korea. And the Chinese did invade Vietnam once, but that was 615 years ago. And then they had a skirmish for 1 month in 1979. Other than that, that's the so-called enemy of the United States. So that's why I call it a neurosis. China's the least threat possible. Doesn't threaten anybody. Doesn't attack anybody. Hasn't been in any war for 46 years, and the war that it was in 46 years ago lasted 1 month. That's when Vietnam toppled a government in Cambodia that China viewed as an ally, and so it punished Vietnam for a month for having overthrown their ally in Cambodia. Other than that, no wars for more than 4 decades. But we're in a funk because the American idea is you have to be number one so you can boss everyone else around. And by the way, we learned every trick we know from the British, who did that for 200 years before that. So that's where the geopolitics comes in. What Adam Smith is saying in 1776 is we need to look forward to a future in which there is equal force, mutual respect, social justice. And we're at that hinge moment of history. Because to my way of thinking, we are at the end of 3 major cycles. First, with these momentous discoveries that Adam Smith talked about, these sea routes that the Europeans found, that began a period of European ascent in the world history and world economy, because Europe was nothing special economically or geopolitically in 1500. You would not put it as likely to succeed or to dominate. But those events changed the course of events. Then in 1750 and really in 1776, oddly enough, the same year that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, a very skilled engineer, we would say today, but he didn't have that title, a man named James Watt, working at the University of Glasgow, fittingly at a university, stuck a condenser on a steam engine that had been invented decades before and suddenly the steam engine became incredibly efficient, low cost, and suddenly the industrial age was feasible because of that great invention of the steam engine. That happened, that commercial steam engine of James Watt, which is why we talk about megawatts today, because of Mr. Watt and the power that his steam engine brought. That came in 1776, and Britain was the first country to industrialize, and it really did beat up the rest of the world after that, because the industrialization, the power that came with that, the industrial military led to a worldwide imperialism that dominated the 19th and the first part of the 20th century. And at its apogee, the British Empire had 1/4 of all the people in the world under British imperial domination. Of course, India was a big part of that 25% of humanity. So that's the second part of a cycle. And then, because Europe has a very hard time making peace within Europe. It's really a sickness, actually, I'm sorry to say. We love Europe. My wife's born in Europe. My family comes from Europe. But they fight each other so much. Not my wife and me, but every two countries bear a grudge. Yesterday, I was texting with a friend of mine who wrote to me because he was giving a lecture in Poland, in Warsaw. And I said, yes, it's so sad, the hatred of Russia in Poland. And he said, oh, but remember what Russia did. And he said, you have to remember, in 1792, that's what he wrote. And I wrote, get over it. You don't have to fight every time, because in 1792, you fought because the Russians would say, yeah, 1792, but in 1610, you invaded us. And that's true, by the way. Poland started it. When Russia was in trouble, in so-called times of trouble in 1610, it was Poland that invaded Russia. Then Russia invaded Poland 150 years later, and on, and they can't stop. And there is, by the way, there's the famous saying of the philosopher George Santayana, the Spanish philosopher of the 20th century, that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. And my wife has a better one, though. Sonia says those who remember history are condemned to repeat it, because all you do is you bear a grudge for 1,000 years. Get over it. So I think that so I was going to say Europe destroyed itself in two civil wars, which we call World War I and World War II. And by the end of the Second World War, Europe was so broken that decolonization came. Not, by the way, because it was inevitable had there not been the wars, but Britain was bankrupt at the end of 1945, after 2 world wars. And Europe had lost any claim whatsoever, not that it deserved it ever, but any claim that it was a civilizing mission or anything else. Not only was it a completely reckless and cruel incivility of the imperial age, but they couldn't even within Europe behave with any decency, and slaughtered tens of millions of people. So at the end of World War II, imperialism wasn't quite over, though. Europe lost its colonies step by step. Sometimes there were wars of decolonization in Africa. Sometimes it went more quickly and somewhat peacefully. It all depended But there was one more empire that was going to stand, and that was the United States empire, because the U.S. became a world empire, and not only a world empire in 1945, and again, having learned the tricks of the trade from Britain, it was a world empire that aspired to dominate the world. And the policy of the United States was there should be no rival. So this was not quite possible because one major power, the Soviet Union itself, did not want to be dominated by the United States, and rather than making peace between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which were allies in World War II, remember that, they were allies. The U.S. and Britain said, we're enemies of our ally, the one that had actually broken the back of Hitler's army, because the Soviet people lost 27 million in World War II. They bore the brunt of World War II. They defeated Hitler, but the U.S. and Britain did not know how to make peace. They said the Soviet Union's the new enemy, and a Cold War emerged. And I put a lot of the responsibility on the U.S. side for this, because what Russia or the Soviet Union wanted was for Germany to be demilitarized and neutral. And the United States said, no, Germany will be remilitarized and part of our new military alliance, NATO. And the Soviet Union said, now you're a threat to us again. And that led to decades of Cold War. So we lost what could have been the peace. But the United States saw the Soviet Union as, of course, the enemy. The Soviet economic system was not so great, and the U.S. was out to break it in any event through controls on technology and isolation, containment it was called. And as of 1991, the Soviet Union had an economic collapse, and it collapsed into 15 successor states. And I mention this because at that moment, the United States said, oh my God, now we made it. We're alone. We run the world. And believe me, that's how they felt. And that was an illusion, a delusion. They thought Russia, that's a nothing. And they thought China, don't they grow rice there? That's an impoverished country of villages. We don't even have to worry about that. We are the sole superpower of the world. Well, that's not how economics works, actually, because Adam Smith's insight is completely right, which is that if you are fortunate to have open trade, peace, and good economic policies, you get a lot of catching up by the transmission of knowledge, technology, and the opportunities for rapid advance. So while the United States wasn't watching, and I know they weren't watching because they're not very clever there in Washington, I have to tell you, and they don't understand much of economics at all. They weren't paying attention, but China was growing at 10% per year, thank you. And if you do that, you double the size of your economy every 7 years. And if you do that for 35 years, which China did, you've doubled 5 times. And doubling 5 times means you've grown 32 times. And if you continue beyond that, China has increased the size of its economy 40 times since 1980. 40 times. It's now a bigger economy than the United States. It's a much bigger industrial power. It is technologically more advanced than the United States in most sectors, not all, but in most sectors right now. When you drive your vehicles 10 years from now, they will be Chinese electric vehicles. And even if you happen to drive a Tesla, that's a Chinese vehicle, by the way, with Elon Musk at the top. But it's the gigafactory in Shanghai that gives it even a chance to compete. So China made it, and that's why we're at the end of yet another cycle. The European imperial age is over, the British imperial age ended in 1945, and the U.S. imperial age is ending right now. And that's why Donald Trump is home. Because he doesn't want to be one of several. That's all. The delusion is still in Washington, by the way. It's not over. It's still a powerful country. It's still a dangerous country. It's got too big a military. It still has its hands on the valves of the international payment system to a large extent. It can turn on and off the spigot for countries that are vulnerable. Remember, the IMF and the World Bank are U.S. institutions, even though they are multilateral institutions. They were founded for not bad purposes, by the way, but they are American-dominated institutions, and that gives continuing power. And I always emphasize geography in thinking about economics. So the geography is that at Pennsylvania Avenue, which is where the White House is, now there's a West Wing and no East Wing because he knocked it down a couple weeks ago, this idiot. Excuse me. Sorry, it's true. I'm just being technical. At 16th in Pennsylvania is the White House. 15th in Pennsylvania is the Treasury Building. 17th in Pennsylvania is what's called the Executive Office of the President of the U.S. 18th in Pennsylvania is the World Bank. And 19th in Pennsylvania is the International Monetary Fund. So it's only 2 blocks from the President's office to tell the IMF what to do. You don't even need to text it. It takes 30 seconds to walk across the street to say, veto that country's program. And that's still power. But it's power that is fading. It's fading in part because of the BRICS. Because the BRICS are saying, we don't need to be under the thumb of a U.S. empire. That's what President Lula said when he was hosting the BRICS this summer, and Trump put on a tariff on Brazil because he didn't like a court proceeding against the preceding president who had tried to make a coup. And so he put on a penalty tariff, and President Lula said, we don't need an emperor, and we're not going to succumb to this kind of pressure. So the BRICS, of which you are an esteemed member, the S in BRICS, remember the 10 BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Egypt and Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Indonesia. The 10 BRICS countries have 46% of the world population. Thank you. And 41% of the world GDP. And they can look at the G7 and say, who are you? And that's what they're doing. So this is the new phase of geopolitics. The world is not falling apart, but the U.S. and Europe are having a tantrum. That's different. And the world is not fragmenting. The U.S. is isolating itself. It doesn't even go to the parties anymore. It puts on tariffs. It says, you can't have our market. And the rest of the world says, okay, because your market's not so important for us. And Trump said, okay, we're going to punish you, China, for being so successful, by the way. We're going to put 100% tariff on you. And the next hour, China said, okay, we're putting 120% tariff on you. And then Trump said, okay, we're going to restrict any advanced chips going to you. And China said, okay, no rare earth magnets. And the U.S. within a half an hour said, we surrender. By the way, I had no idea there was anything called a rare earth magnet before all of this happened. So I had to ask ChatGPT what it was exactly. It turns out it's absolutely essential for all manufacturing, for automotive, for military, and so on. And China makes them. The U.S. doesn't make them. And so turned out the U.S. learned a bit of a lesson there. Again, yet another reason why Donald Trump is staying home. So this is why we're at such a historic juncture. But the world is really not fragmenting. It's remaining open and it's trading. It's just that one corner of the world is very surly. The part that used to dominate just can't figure out what's going on. And Trump is, of course, trying to flex the military muscles in a disgusting way. The U.S. is still militarily powerful, no doubt about it. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza are imperial wars. The war in Ukraine came because the United States said after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we'll move all our military bases up to the Russian border. And by the way, in 1990, when Germany was reunifying and President Gorbachev was president still of the Soviet Union, the United States promised President Gorbachev, if you, the Soviet Union, agree to the reunification of Germany, which had been divided after World War II in the Cold War, and required the Soviet approval because that was how World War II ended by treaty in 1990. The only real treaty that ended World War II was in 1990. They needed the Soviet agreement. And to get the Soviet agreement, the United States said to President Gorbachev, we promise NATO won't move 1 inch eastward. Not 1 inch. And if you want all the documentary record of that, go to a website called National Security Archive of George Washington University, and go to a website that is called What Gorbachev Heard, and you'll find 42 documents or so that say all of what I just said, that the U.S. promised NATO would never enlarge. But as soon as the Soviet Union ended and the United States said, we're all alone in this, then they started exactly what they promised they wouldn't do, which was eastward enlargement of NATO. And that's why there's the war in Ukraine. It's a disgrace. And it is killing the Ukrainians. And it is part of the famous adage of Henry Kissinger, which you may recall, that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. Ukraine said, we'll be a friend, and now they're dying because of that. Because they said, okay, NATO enlarged. The United States said, we have your back. And probably 2 million Ukrainians have been killed or gravely wounded in this completely unnecessary and reckless war. And the United States is doing the same with Israel in Gaza. And let me thank you, South Africa, for standing up for justice. It was very brave, very right, very precise to launch the International Court of Justice case on Israel's violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. The ICJ takes too long to rule, but the evidence that South Africa brought on behalf of the whole world is absolutely right and compelling.
All right, welcome back. Now, let's dive deep into this one. And what really Jeffrey Sachs is saying here is, first of all, what we note here clearly, and he's trying to explain, is that America's absence signals the decline of an empire. Undeniably, and many people have been talking about this. Many Americans and scholars have been actually, this has been just an obvious, trend in the recent few years. And when Professor Sachs is highlighting here, what he's trying to highlight is really bigger than Donald Trump himself. It's about America. It's about a global empire that is, losing its grip, because for decades, America really positioned itself as the leader of global decision making. They didn't really ask for permissions, they expected compliance. They dictated what really happened. They were always the leaders. But now at the G20, the world's top economies, met without the United States of America at the table, not even at the leadership. They were completely a no-show. And the world moved. The world kept moving, and that alone shows how much global balance of power has changed. America's absence does not paralyze anything right now. It's high time we accept that the world doesn't stop when America stops. The world will just, shift, realign, and it moves. It simply exposed a reality that we refuse to accept, that the American empire is also declining, and the world will just, the rest of the world will adjust automatically and continue without them, And this is exactly not collapse per se. It's a transition. Empires always rise, they peak, and eventually they decline. It has happened to the Roman Empire, to the British Empire, And now the American Empire is showing the same cracks. If you look at it from the inside, there's a lot of divisions, there's a lot of political intolerance, there's a lot of, the country is so politically charged, especially right now with Donald Trump, and a lot of insecurity about the rising competitors and competitions. I've been asking myself, what is it about Trump and always, making China look like it's the biggest enemy of the United States of America? Are they really an enemy? Do they really? What is the point of conflict? Now, this brings us to the second point that Professor Sachs is trying to point out, and it is the rise of China, especially without war. And that's very important to also point out, the point of rising without war. So one of the most important things Sachs points out is the contrast between America's rise to global dominance and global power compared to China's rise to global status, global, power dominance. And America's global dominance was or is continuing to be built and sustained by military interventions, regime changes, wars in the Middle East, in every other place, and a foreign policy rooted in force, brute force and intimidation. But, when you look at China, on the other hand, trade, technology, manufacturing power, infrastructure projects in different places, and especially the global south, what China is doing to win, Africa. So whether people agree with China or not, and I personally sometimes really question the relationship, especially China has with Africa or some African countries, there's something we cannot deny. China has not literally like bombed its way to the top, And sometimes you look at what China does, and it really borders exploitation in Africa. But for the most part, you will find that it is an African problem. They have corrupt leaderships and regimes that allow for exploitation. So it's not China that initiates the exploitation. They have just gotten a window from people that have not really organized their thing. So it is an African problem sometimes. Now, I think this kind of rise of China and the influence is what really terrifies America and people like Trump, because it disrupts the Western belief that dominance, does not require violence, what they have always known. So Sachs even calls China peaceful, in a sense that, in comparison, because China hasn't intimidated or anybody or initiated any global wars and destabilizations in regions, but the US has actually really lived to do that and perfected so much in doing it. And now that is not a tactic that is very applicable, that is why everything is happening like it is. So what Trump is actually doing, and what Professor Jeffrey Sachs criticizes, is, trying to turn China into an enemy to simply just justify America's decline. That's what Trump is probably doing. Instead of improving themselves, they're picking fights and getting excuses, getting, a scapegoat. So this is also trying to point out at Trump's ego and America's insecurity generally. So Sachs highlights how Trump's ideology, or how Trump himself frames everything as competition, an attack, or a threat. And that's because Trump and America more broadly, or even Europe by extension, cannot imagine a world where they are not the leaders. America does not want to imagine a world where they are not number one. They cannot imagine a world of equals, so to say. It's not even about who is on top, who is the first one. They manufacture enemies, they recruit friends to become enemies of their enemies. They look for someone to blame. China becomes a threat, Russia becomes a threat, and even their own allies become threats if they don't obey, if they don't really work with, their rules. So really, I think Trump, from my perspective, skipping the G20 summit is not a show of strength. It's just a kind of insecurity. It was a fear of really facing the world where, America is no longer the center of gravity. That's painfully the truth, So this also brings us to the point of a multipolar or multipolarity in the world, and it's right here today. The world is shifting into, a multipolar reality, meaning power is no longer concentrated in one country. Power is no longer with America alone. Today we have China rising economically, India expanding politically, Russia rising or asserting its military dominance, and even Africa gaining a lot of strategic importance in the world. Latin America strengthening regional alliances, and we are entering a world where multiple countries, influence affairs in different ways. America can't really just now bully and hoard all the power and dictate, terms like before. And that's exactly why, their absence in the G20 summit will not or did not really derail the plan necessarily, but it was very conspicuous. It was, to be honest, very, very conspicuous because, yeah, they're still a global powerhouse. We're not used to not seeing them in such spaces. So the world has options now, to be honest. Look at what is happening when Trump slaps 100% tariffs to China. They just look towards Brazil and Argentina for the same crops that they would normally have to import from America. It tells you the world has more options currently. So what does really this also mean for Africa? And perhaps this is the most important part of this entire conversation. Regarding, because of the fact that it was actually held in Africa, I think for the first time. And I'd point out that while China is not perfect, Africa's experience in terms of relations with, with China has, fundamentally been very different from Africa's experience with the so-called the West. America and Europe. Because China, what it does is it invests, it trades, there's mutual respect, China brings infrastructure, and even if it also benefits from all that, at least they have something to show. There's a trade. And there was what really the West has always done in Africa: extracted, destabilized, colonized, lectured, regime changes, installed puppets, and just taken advantage without really, recognizing that Africa really also needs to use its own resources for its own benefit. This doesn't mean Africa should really blindly trust China. Oh, really? Absolutely not. Africa must be cautious with every single partner, everybody that comes to them: China, America, Russia, Europe, anybody, all of them. Africa must negotiate with trust strategy and protect its own interests first. I always say nobody has Africa's interest, first before their own. So when Sachs says that the West cannot, accept losing to China, it's true, because China is winning Africa not through force and bombs, but through cooperation, even if not in the most perfect way. But Africa has a way of correcting that by standing its ground and negotiating in its own terms. So the G20 summit in South Africa, showed something symbolic, or it was rather symbolic for Africa, especially, that Africa is no longer sitting on the sidelines as a spectator of global, discussions, global discourse, and global politics. Africa is basically also hosting the table, and that's important. That means a lot. Huh? So Trump's absence from the G20 wasn't just a diplomatic snub. If you look at it, really, it was a sign of a declining empire, unable to adjust to a shifting world, unable to accept the inevitable truth that they have reached their peak and now it's a decline. The global order is really changing, and the dominance of the US is rather quickly fading. China is rising. The global South that comprise of Africa is awakening, and Africa finally is becoming a key player in the next phase of global power. And as Professor says it clearly, the world can be built on mutual respect. Most importantly, shared power and peaceful coexistence. You don't have to be the first one. You don't have to bully your way. You don't have to be the police of the world. We can live on mutual respect, on mutual understanding, and we can have shared power. And but that can only really be realized if we stop allowing old empires with old rules in the book to dictate the rules of the new world. Yeah. So that is that for this video. I don't know what you think about what we have tackled in this video. Do share with me what you think in the comment section below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't, or if you're new to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.